Okay, look, there's about a 2-hour talk here, and I'm running through in 20 minutes, so please excuse me if you go rather fast. Some of this has been published already in Communal Societies Journal, and some will be later published. This is part of a macro project that's been engaging me for 20-odd years, trying to document all intentional communities, past and present, within Australia and New Zealand. It's a losing battle because they create them faster than I can find them, and I discover historical ones faster than I can research the ones I find. But in visiting one women-only community, I was challenged as why aren't there any men-only intentional communities, and said, well, of course there are. And then somebody said, well, how come there was no historical ones? And I realized there's been a hell of a lot. So I'm taking you on a gallop through the politics of single-sex intentional communities. Please don't waste time arguing what's intentional or not, or secular or not, because I know all that and we can engage in that later. The literature is almost nothing published in this area. I did extensive literature research. I contacted colleagues around the world, could find almost zilch covering this. There's a few people writing about it, but it tends to be very indulgent, showing that we have found the answer. There's nothing academic. From Cantor's work, we always start off with some model, and I predicted from a very crude reading of Cantor that we should predict that these single-sex communities should last longer than mixed ones. That's a very rough reading of part of Cantor, and it's arguable. There's very poor historical records for a number of reasons, are biased. Contemporary research is amazingly problematic. Your gender and your sexual orientation are crucial in being able to do this research, and you'll find that's why I know a lot more about some contemporary communities than others. Interestingly, male-only intentional communities are much easier to research, not just if you're a male. And there's a whole issue about gender politics that comes up in here, and I've had a number of female researchers agree on that one. And it brings the question, which we don't have time to touch, why are people so touchy about this? But they are. It's very... the first I could find, and there may be an earlier one I haven't found yet, was the Spinster Land Association. It was on the eastern edge of South Australia. I'll show you on a map, 1872. There was some very serious reporting issues on this, and so my records are very patchy. I've spent nearly 10 years searching for more information and failing. We have newspaper reports such as this that make certain, refer to them as having Amazonian, which in Victorian jargon meant lesbian predilections. They talked about a Lake Cadmite. That looks like a play on the word catamite. Catamite was a male kept for sexual pleasures. They also talk about a colonial Salt Lake. Well, Salt Lake City equaled Mormons, equaled polygamy, so there were also suggestions of that. The problem is we don't know whether this group ever really existed. Because going through land records, et cetera, I can find no contact on the ground for them. So I don't know. I think they existed for a short period of time. Whether any of these suggestions are valid or not, we don't know, okay? And that's where they were, in this area of Australia. That's the very first one. The first one we know that absolutely existed was a male group in Melbourne, Victoria. They were also Australia's first urban commune called Cooperative Home, founded by these two gentlemen, 1888 to 1890. There were 6 males lived together, and I'll show you their house in a minute. They supported themselves by publishing anarchist newspaper, running a vegetarian restaurant, which also was Australia's first vegetarian, and certainly the first vegan restaurant in Australia. That's the house they lived in, a very normal house. They tried to live as a family unit of 6 males and did very well. Of course, the neighbors weren't impressed. They weren't sure what these guys were getting up to. This is just one of the ads for their restaurant, etc., and their bookshop. Unfortunately, John Andrews, one of the founders, had a mental breakdown. This is a photograph taken of him when he was going into a mental institution, and the other one's not a very good photograph. Very interesting urban commune. By far the biggest of all of these was Alice River community in Queensland, where I come from, near Barcaldine, 1891 to 1907. It was a massive group, came out of the shearers' strike. I won't go into, but it was one of the two times Australia came very close to civil war. The other was the Eureka Stockade in Victoria. The shearers' strike came up where British soldiers, etc., were sent in. It was quite serious. That's where they were located, up in the area of Queensland. Brisbane's down here, just to give you a base. This is just some images from newspapers at the time. These are some of the communards preparing to face the troops. This is an image of the military camp where the soldiers were. In the end, that serious confrontation with bayonets did not come, but it was very, very, very close. A group of these strikers decided, to hell with capitalism, we're out of here, and decided to create a commune, which they did, called Alice River. 72 men joined in 1891. They squatted on some Crown land, and there's something called an occupation license, which I won't go into explaining. Some of them worked off-site, and all money was pooled. There was no private property. There was no private accommodation. Everybody ate together. Shearing teams always had a cook, so they had a series of excellent cooks, and so that was never a problem. They grew oranges, peaches, etc., a whole range of vegetables, etc. They were not vegetarian. That was never part of their thing. They also had a dairy industry, and a public health researcher found some information showing how the health of babies in this area at the time was much better than anywhere else in Queensland because these products were available. Dairy products, etc., were available that simply were not available in lots of rural Australia at that time. So they had quite an interesting impact. They also had some sheep and wool, etc., pigs' bacon. They sold locally, shipped by rail, etc. That does not mean that it had Chinese in it. Chinese garden was a term for the time meaning small vegetable garden, small and fenced vegetable. That was just a layout of them, so that would be fruit tree, larger vegetables, things like potatoes, that would be their orchards, etc., houses spread along there. But they didn't have separate houses, and I'll show you a couple of images in a minute. We only have one photograph, and I've spent a lot of time trying to find only one photograph. The others are woodcuts, general view in 1892. The only photograph is supposed to be their first library. They weren't into architecture very much. They had a stone dairy, which was, I'll show you some remains of that in a minute, to keep the milk cool, etc., etc. This is in front of their kitchen and dining room. He's one of the few people we have a name for. The others aren't so identifiable. But it does look like something out of a Wild West movie. The sleeping quarters, they slept. A few of them didn't want to sleep with other men, so they would be out even in a tent or something. Others would sleep 5 or 6 together. This was the main reading room. Now, for some reason, that seemed to be separate from the library, and I can't understand that yet. This is a more recent photograph. This was from about 1903 or 4. He's the agricultural advisor who was American, and this is just in front of their citrus orchards. Very prosperous group. They managed to get some government support, even given them a free steam pump. They were one of the groups in developing steam irrigation in Australia. They're very, this notion of making the desert bloom came up, and there's a whole, that's of course one of the things with the kibbutzim, the notion of making the desert bloom. It was also very much communal groups in this part of Australia and elsewhere, the same notion that had a whole religious basis to it about the desert. But that's another question. Everything belonged to all residents. There was aging members resisted accepting new members because that would dilute the ownership. There was issues around that. In 1904, they gave up their complete communal structure and established themselves as what's called a private company, meaning that each person had exactly the same number of shares. On one level, that didn't matter. On another level, it did, because suddenly it meant that people could sell their shares to somebody else. 2 of them sold their shares. The 2 new members, who were much younger, which is what they wanted, didn't really fit in, because these older men, by then they were in their 50s and 60s, had established a pretty safe, secure way of life. And then you had these 2 younger guys coming in. By then they're down to a membership of only 7. It had slowly, slowly dropped down. One of them then did the unthinkable and got married. And the poor woman coming in, there's not a slight bit of evidence that she disrupted anything deliberately, but her mere presence was quite a destabilizing thing, and ultimately led to the demise of the group. In 1907, they decided to sell out, and they did. And the good news is that when they sold it, each man got about £500. Now, at that time, you could buy quite a nice house in the city of Brisbane for about £200. So that's so that's a fortune for a working class person at that time. Only one of them got to enjoy it. Everybody else died fairly quickly after then in somewhat mysterious circumstances. Not criminal, but it was quite bizarre. And there's another whole story around that I need to read. This is remains of where some of their houses are. That's all that's left on the ground. And this is one of the interesting ones. This is an image from the double dunny. One of the things they were dunny is toilet. Everything was communal, including going to the toilet. And so they wouldn't have a single toilet. You have a double one, so you can share with somebody else. From the same era, Ramco commune. Ram has nothing to do with Ram as in the male, but it started in Murray River area of South Australia, and I'll show that in 1894 to 1903. Started with 28 single males again. They split from another commune called Wakery, and that's a different story. Wakery was fairly conventional. They still followed the monogamous family unit, and this group of males, very strongly imbued with socialism and Christianity, believed that they needed to break away from that. That the monogamous family unit was bad, it was evil, it was restricting them. They needed to create a whole new male-only world. They grew fruit, mainly citrus. By 1896, that was breaking down. And we found first one, then two women present, not as marriage partners, but as co-workers with them. And then the unthinkable happened, and one of them got married, and then a child arrived. And so they were really only male-only for probably about 2 to 3 years. They still listed, kept going to 1903 when they were privatized, became a cooperative. Some of you will know them as Ramco Wine Group. That's where they came from, near Adelaide. Just a couple of photos. This is one of the paddle wheel steamers on the Murray River arriving at the commune. That is not a woman, in spite of it appears to be. It's actually a man with a suitcase. One of the few images we have within the commune. So they had much better buildings. They looked after themselves much better than did the group at Alice River. Ramco Wine Group, still today. And some of you might, I don't know if you buy that here, Cock and Bull wine. Is anybody familiar with that wine label? Well, you should be. It's fantastic wine, and they were delighted, the company were delighted that I was going to be at a conference here and promote their wine. And I suggested they might want to send me a carton to take over, but they didn't respond. Look for that, if you ever see it, because it's a lovely bit of a follow-on from them. Amazona. Now, Amazona is fictional, and there's a reason why I'm still including it here, because it sort of turned into reality. So it didn't, what I'm telling you didn't, invented by a man called Horace Tucker, Reverend, 1894. He wrote a book called The New Arcadia, and in it he talked about a fictional women-only commune in rural Victoria. 250 women, 50 houses. They dined, worked together and everything, fruit, vegetables, etc. They were armed, prepared to defend themselves, so they were a lesbian separatist group. It never formed, but then Tucker went on to form 7 other rural communes in the 1890s with nearly 2,000 members, but none of them were women only. And so I don't know why he didn't follow through with his own idea. That's Horace Tucker. Another interesting man. Wirrawidar, which did get formed, that's an indigenous word for something. And by the way, this is within a walking distance of where the Narara eco-village is being established, where some of you know it's, well, a long walking distance, probably an hour's walk. It's near Sydney, New South Wales. Created 1894 to 1900 by Mary Sanger Evans, very, very much a first-wave feminist in Australia. It had 10 women. They dined, worked together, lived together, all in one. In fact, they all slept in the one big room. I don't think they were lesbian, but the records are unclear on that, and maybe it doesn't matter. They've supported themselves. They were going to do silk production. They never quite got that part of it together. So it's mainly fruit, vegetable, herbs. They also opened a grocery store in the area. One of the women was a midwife. So they had various forms of income. Just north of Sydney. That's Mary Sanger Evans, the best photo I can get. And she doesn't have missing a tooth, but it looks like that in this photo because it's not a terribly good photo. The other photo I have is even worse of her. Died in 1900. That was where they all lived. So everybody slept up in this loft area. There must have been another window on that side. I don't know. And downstairs they had their office, their eating area, their library, and all of this sort of thing. And they're very, very important in the early feminist movement in Australia. They were a model. That's the bakery over here. That's just the barn that was at their commune. A couple of terrible cartoons. This is planting mulberry trees for silk production. Unfortunately, wallabies love mulberry trees, and nobody thought of that. So the next photo was trying to fence to keep the wallabies out, but unfortunately, wallabies can jump pretty high, higher than a woman's head. And so things didn't work out. Amelia, which sort of came into being and sort of didn't. Another women-only commune. Denmark on the very southwest of South Australia. And I'll show you that in a minute. It's not Denmark, but Denmark and Australia. Emily Crawford, who some of you, if anybody here has studied journalism, will know she was the first female journalist to work as an international correspondent for any newspaper in the world. She's still something of an icon in teaching about journalism and the role of women, etc., etc. British. It struggled from 1906 to 1916, but it's arguable. They never really got on the land they were supposed to be on. It was one of these, we're gonna, that never quite made it for a number of reasons. 14 women joined, all from England. Went over, they were all single women. One was a widow. One was a widow. The others were all unmarried women from England. Went over, they all had property. They all had some money. It was not for the working classes. This is for women of some social position. They were going to dine, live, work together. They were going to operate a health spa. Another thing, they all had management abilities. Most of them had gone to agricultural colleges, and so they were going to make money out of managing other people's properties, managing farms for other people. Doing lots of cultural work was going to be part of their thing. That's where it was set to be. And there is an intentional community there right now. The Wallery is almost on the exact same site as that. So if any of you have heard of the Wallery community, they adjoin this property. That's Emily Crawford. Oh, bloody hell. Emily Crawford, we're going to really fast. That's one of the things. She ended up in an insane asylum, and unfortunately, and the whole thing collapsed. Recent, contemporary, women only. The best known is Amazon Acres. Another few names. Some I don't even know whether they're still going because nobody will tell me or let me find out. The main area for the women's separate ones is in north of Sydney in here. Men only, a couple of images, Amazon Acres. Now I had to agree to blank out the license plate of that truck because the woman who sent it to me wouldn't let me use her name to acknowledge her. It all had to be done anonymously, and also wanted that blocked out so that no other woman could check who she is because she was It's quite bizarre, some of the fear that runs through the women's separatist communal movement. It's funny, and it's not funny at all. Amazon Acres, that's her communal house. That's just from her land. One of the buildings I was allowed an image of. And the Valley, which is not a misspelling. That's how they spell it. These are very, very isolated, very, very protective and very fearful groups. And not terribly pleasant in how they manage to cope. Quite different. Eden Farm, Women's Communal Living Project. Stephen's here, he's already been out there. Kay Healy, this is the opposite end of the women's separatist thing. It's lovely. It's based on the medieval beguines. 5 long-term residents, numerous short-term people, individual owner, rough consensus. Between Sydney and Canberra, that's the founder, lovely woman. That's what it looks like from there. Beautiful area, very prosperous. They have regular open dinners for women to come and just relate to them. There's one of them. That's their lounge. Very, very pleasant area, meeting. Some of the sleeping and meeting areas. So it's very bourgeois, very upmarket compared to the others. Men only, some recent ones. I'll just give you some of the names. The earliest one's 1976. Mandala, I'll show you an image of in a minute. Fairyland, I'll show you an image of that in a minute as well. Most of these were from the very north of New South Wales, what you might hear of as the Rainbow region. south of Brisbane. Mandala, just a couple of images. This is one of the mealtime. Mandala's closed now. I've been there. It's no problem going to either of these for me as a male or for you as a female researcher. They're very open, very different structures. One of the, just after the mealtime, lying around. And women are not precluded. Women can't live there, but women can certainly visit there. Just a gathering of members, so that gives you an idea, about 20 members there when I was doing my research. A lot of the men had separate little sleeping huts. Some regularly slept together. Otherwise, they were very open, so they had a very not monogamous relationships. Fairyland, or the fairy sanctuary. This is lunchtime, and I love just coming in from the field, so he has on it. This is at somebody's birthday party. Now, he was one of my main informants, but there's no problem me getting information here or visiting. And again, for women, visiting is not a problem, but women can't live there. This is they have what they call glitter parties. The glitter party is when you try to outdo your campness over everybody else. So they're sort of sending up the whole movement in this as well. I mean, I love this guy in his old bathing suit and these sorts of things, and this chappie here. But they also, they also work very hard. So that's the same chap you just saw robbing the bees in the office, etc. Lovely group, gardening, foundations, building a new house there. Now, what are some of the findings? I think I have about 30 seconds. Okay. What are some of the findings from this? That there are three types, basically, that I was able. One, you have groups that are there for political and social, but not for sexual ends. Okay, and so some of the early women's communities fitted into that. So we don't think that they were lesbian or gay within the conventional sense of the word. They were there because they just, for political ends. It's important for me to live with other men for political reasons, not for sex. The other one is obviously for political or social and sexual ends, and almost all of the contemporary ones fit into that. So they are lesbian, separatists, or they are male, gay males, as well as the political ends. So they're very, very anxious that I don't see that they were just here to have lots of good sex. We're here for political reasons as well. Okay, and all of these also have a whole range of environmental reasons. And the third, oddly enough, is we have groups that end up single-sex almost by accident or for convenience, and we're not really sure. Alice River, they never disliked women. Women came out there all the time. Some of the men seem to have had girlfriends, but women couldn't live there. But it wasn't because women are evil, it was just that's kind of the way we are sort of thing. The same with Cooperative Home. All but one of the men, that's in the first urban commune, ended up marrying. And Ramco the same. So we get some of these that it's almost accidental for part of their lives that they're single sex. The longevity, I said at the beginning that the prediction from Cantor's work would suggest these should last slightly longer, perhaps. I didn't find that at all. They either last about the same or even less. So they don't have a terribly good record of longevity. And finally, there's a desperate need for some good comparable research from other countries. And I hope that some of my colleagues will start challenging what I'm coming up with here and finding American or British work looking, or from anywhere looking at this. Because I'm assuming all other countries have such group, have had and do now. And maybe my results are wrong because they're right for Australia. Maybe they're wrong because we can't generalize from them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill.